The letters were bound with a strip of faded green ribbon, the kind her mother had once used to tie back the kitchen curtains in their house in Cincinnati. Evangeline Pruitt had carried them for 3 days in the pocket of her traveling coat, close against her ribs, as if they were something living that needed warmth to survive. 14 letters in all, each one written in the same cramped, deliberate hand. Each one signed Silas Worth. She had read them so many times she could recite passages in the dark. The land here is wide, and the sky goes on longer than you'd think a sky has any right to. My house sits on a rise above the river, and in the mornings the light comes in from the east and fills the whole front room. I am a plain man, and I don't say things pretty, but I mean what I say. I mean every word of this. She believed him. God help her. She had believed every word. The train pulled into Harlan's Creek, Wyoming, just past 4 in the afternoon, a low sun throwing long copper shadows across the platform planks. It was smaller than she'd imagined. A water tower, a station house with peeling white paint, a single bench worn smooth by years of waiting bodies. She stepped down from the car with her carpet bag in one hand and her trunk checked at the rear. The air was dry and smelled of sage and something distant she couldn't place. Not bad, just foreign. Evangeline was 24 years old. Her parents had died of the same fever, 11 months apart, when she was 22. The house in Cincinnati had gone to settle debts she hadn't known existed. She had spent the next year in her aunt's home in Pittsburgh, sleeping in a room no bigger than a pantry, and earning her keep by mending shirts for the neighbors. She had placed an advertisement in the Ladies' Home Companion the previous February, her handwriting careful and steady, even though her heart had been anything but. Young woman of honest character and capable hands seeks correspondence with a gentleman of the West. Matrimony earnestly hoped for. 15 men had written to her. She had answered 3. She had kept writing to only 1. The platform emptied quickly. Families reunited, greetings exchanged, bags loaded onto wagons. One by one the small domestic knots untied themselves and moved off into the town. Evangeline stood and watched the road that led from the station. He had written that he would come himself. I'll be there before the train is. I am not a man who is late to things that matter. She waited. The sun dropped further. The shadow of the water tower stretched across the ground until it reached her shoes. A boy of about 12 came out of the station house, looked at her with frank curiosity, and went back inside. A dog crossed the road at the far end and disappeared between 2 buildings. The air grew cooler. He was not coming. The knowledge arrived not with a crash, but with a slow, cold seep, like water rising in a cellar. She pressed her palm flat against the letters in her pocket and made herself breathe evenly. She was not going to weep on a train platform in a town she did not know. She was not. She picked up her carpet bag. The station agent, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, was locking up the main door when she approached him. "Excuse me," she said. "Is there a boarding house in town?" He looked at her over the rims of his glasses, not unkindly. "Mrs. Dunbar's on Sycamore Street. 2 blocks north, turn left at the feed store. Can't miss the blue shutters. Thank you. You need help with your trunk, miss." "I'll manage." She would manage. She had been managing for 2 years. She had barely turned away when she heard the sound of hooves on the packed dirt road. Slow, unhurried. The sound of a horse that was not in a hurry because its rider saw no need to be. She did not turn around. She had stopped expecting him. The afternoon train's already gone. The voice came from behind her, low, measured, roughened at the edges, as if it had spent most of its life out of doors, and had never quite smoothed back down. She turned. The man sitting the chestnut horse was not young, 40 perhaps, or near enough to it that the difference didn't matter. He was lean and broad-shouldered at once. the way men get who work with their bodies every day of their lives. His face was weathered to a deep brown, the skin around his eyes creased from squinting into the sun, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not curious, not guarded, just attentive, the way a man watches a situation he hasn't decided about yet. "I know," she said. "It's already gone." He looked at her carpet bag, at her trunk still sitting where the porter had left it, at the empty platform behind her. "You waiting for somebody?" She considered lying. She considered saying yes, they'll be along shortly, and turning back around, and walking with her chin up until she found the blue shutters on Sycamore Street. But she was tired in a way that went past her feet and her back, and she found she didn't have the energy for false dignity. "I was," she said. "He didn't come." The man was quiet for a moment. He looked down the road toward town, and then back at her, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he had already understood the whole of the situation from those 5 words, and was simply deciding what to do about it. "Mrs. Dunbar's is 2 blocks north," he said finally. "Yes," the station agent told me. He swung down from the saddle in a single easy motion. "I can take your trunk." "That's not necessary. I'm going that direction anyway." He said it simply, as though it were a fact about the weather and not a decision he was making on her behalf. He lifted her trunk, which was heavier than it looked, and secured it across the back of the horse with a few efficient movements. He did not make a show of the effort, though she could see it in the set of his shoulders. He didn't offer her a hand or his arm. He simply took up the reins and started walking, and she found herself walking beside him. They went the 2 blocks in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have nothing to prove to each other yet. Mrs. Dunbar's was a white clapboard house with blue shutters, just as described, set back from the street behind a garden that was mostly gone for the season, a few dry stalks and the ghost of what had been marigolds. A lamp burned in the front window. A woman opened the door before they even reached the gate, stout, with iron-gray hair braided and pinned back, wearing an apron over a dark wool dress. "Owen Greer." She said the name the way you'd say, "Well, of all things. What brings you to town?" "Needed a few things from Prentice." He untied the trunk and set it on the porch steps. "This lady needs a room, Mrs. Dunbar." The older woman's eyes shifted to Evangeline, quick, intelligent, the kind of assessment that takes in a great deal and reveals nothing. "Of course. Come in, dear. You look half done in." Evangeline turned to the man. "Owen Greer." "Thank you, Mr. Greer. I am grateful." He touched the brim of his hat. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, she noticed, and before she could say anything more, he was already back in the saddle, already turning the horse back toward the road, already disappearing into the blue dusk, as though he'd never been quite entirely there. She slept 10 hours and woke to the sound of wind in the eaves and the smell of frying salt pork from somewhere below. The room was small and plain, an iron bed, a washstand, a window looking out onto a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for winter. It was clean, it was warm, it was, for the moment, enough. She lay still for a while and thought, with clear, cold clarity, about what she was going to do. She had $14 left. She had the clothes in her trunk and a modest set of skills. She could keep accounts. She could sew. She could cook well enough. And she had a good hand with figures from 2 years of helping her father manage his small dry goods business before everything fell apart. She was not helpless, but she was a long way from anywhere she had ever been. Silas Worth. She turned the name over in her mind like a stone in a stream, examining it for what it actually was. A man who had written 14 letters about the color of the morning light and the sound of the river, and never once put a real face on any of it. A man who had not come to the station, a man who, she now suspected, had known all along that he would not come. She put the stone down. She would not carry it any further than she already had. Mrs. Dunbar was, as it turned out, a woman of considerable practical intelligence and very little patience for self-pity. She also kept the books for 4 of the businesses on Main Street and had been looking, she informed Evangeline over breakfast, for someone with a decent hand and a head for columns, since her niece had gone and gotten married in the spring. "I can't pay much," she said, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of Evangeline, with the directness of a woman accustomed to being taken on her own terms. "But it covers the room and adds a little besides. When would you like me to start?" Evangeline said. Mrs. Dunbar almost smiled. Monday. It was Saturday. Evangeline had 2 days. She spent them learning the town, the layout of it, the rhythm of it, who was who and what was what. Harlan's Creek was small, but it was not dying. There was a mill, a bank, a general store run by a Mr. Prentice, who seemed to know everything about everybody, a church with a bell that worked, and a school that met in the church on weekdays. There was a saloon, 2 of them, but the one on the near end of town was quiet enough. People nodded to her. A few introduced themselves. It was the kind of town that paid attention to strangers without being hostile about it. She did not ask about Silas Worth. She found, to her own surprise, that she didn't want to know. She saw Owen Greer only once that first week. He came in on Thursday for supplies, his wagon loaded, his hat pulled down against a wind that had turned sharp and northerly. He was tying a sack of flour in the wagon bed when she came out of Prentice's store with a paper of pins she'd needed. He looked up. She nodded. He nodded back. That was all. But she noticed that his boots were clean, despite the mud in the road, and that he thanked Mr. Prentice's boy by name, and that, when old Mr. Aldrich dropped his walking stick near the wagon wheel, Owen Greer was 3 steps away and already bending to retrieve it before the old man had registered what happened. She noticed. She didn't know why she noticed, except that she was the kind of person who paid attention to small things, and small things, in her experience, were usually where the truth lived. It was Mrs. Dunbar who brought them back together, in the way that women of a certain efficiency tend to arrange the world around them without appearing to do so. 3 weeks after Evangeline arrived, Mrs. Dunbar sat down across from her at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a look that meant a conversation was coming, whether Evangeline was ready for it or not. "Owen Greer came in yesterday while you were at the bank," she said. Evangeline kept her eyes on her coffee. "Oh? He has a problem. His father ran the books for the ranch until he passed 2 years ago. Owen does not." She paused. "He's too proud to say so directly, but he came in asking if I knew anyone who might help him sort 3 years of receipts and ledgers before the county assessor comes through in spring." She took a sip of coffee. "I told him I knew someone." Evangeline looked up. "Mrs. Dunbar, you'd work out of his ranch 4 days a week. He'd pay a fair wage on top of your work here, which would only be mornings. His ranch is 3 miles out. He has a horse you can use." She set down her cup. "It's steady work, Evangeline, and you need more than pins and paper money to see you through the winter." Evangeline was quiet for a moment. 3 miles was not 5, and she was not being asked to live there, only to work. "All right," she said. The ranch was called the Greer Place, which was not a very poetic name, but it suited it. A stone and timber house, solid and square, sitting on a low rise above the river bend, with a barn in good repair and a stand of cottonwoods along the waterline. Everything about it spoke of care without vanity, fences that actually worked. A kitchen garden that had been properly put to bed, the beds turned and mounded, ready for spring. Tools hung in the right places in the barn. Owen Greer met her at the gate the first morning, took the horse's bridle and said, "Miss Pruitt." and nothing more by way of welcome. She said, "Mr. Greer," and followed him inside. He led her to a small room off the kitchen that had once been used for canning, judging by the faint sweet ghost of fruit that still clung to the walls. There was a desk, solid if scarred, and a chair, and a window that looked south over the river. On the desk was a crate and 2 wooden boxes, all overflowing with papers. "That's most of it," he said. He looked at the boxes the way a man looks at something he's ashamed of. "There's more in the chest by the stove." "I'll find it," she said. He left her to it. The records were a disaster of the specific, particular kind that happens when a capable man dies suddenly and leaves his work mid-sentence. Receipts stuffed into envelopes. Payments recorded in one ledger and missing from another. An entire summer's worth of cattle sales recorded only in a small notebook that had gotten wedged behind the desk leg and was found on her second day, covered in dust. She worked through it methodically, the way she'd once helped her father untangle the accounts after the warehouse fire. One thing at a time, the past revealing itself slowly, like a room you're cleaning by lamplight. The coffee appeared on the second morning. She came in to find a blue tin cup sitting in the center of the desk, steam rising from it, a tin lid set beside it to keep it warm while she'd been settling the horse. Owen was already out in the yard, visible through the south window, carrying a fence rail across one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. She didn't say anything at lunch. They ate separately. She in the canning room with her work, he coming in to eat, standing at the counter and going back out. But the next morning the cup was there again. And the morning after that, on the 4th day, it occurred to her that he was getting up earlier than he needed to in order to have it ready. She didn't mention it. Some things, she was learning, meant more in the not saying. The weeks settled into a rhythm. She worked through the records with steady care. He worked the ranch. In the late afternoon, when she was packing her things to ride back to town, he would sometimes be on the porch, not watching for her, exactly, but there, mending something with his hands, never quite turning away when she came out. In November, a cold snap came down from the north, and the road from town frosted over by dawn. She arrived one morning on the horse to find him waiting at the gate with a lantern, though it was full daylight. "Road was icy," she said. "I know." He took the horse's bridle. "You should have waited. I had work." He looked at her for a moment, that same steady, attentive look that she had never quite learned to interpret. And then he said, "There's a room here. Small. Used to be for the foreman, before I let him go." He paused. "It's empty. Would be warmer than the road in the mornings." She thought about it. "Mrs. Dunbar would still need my mornings," she said carefully. "That's 3 miles," he said. "Takes half an hour in good weather. Less in your case." He was offering her practicality. He was excellent at offering practicality. She was beginning to suspect it was the only language he trusted himself with. "I'll think about it," she said. She moved her things on a Thursday. The room was small, but it had a good window, south-facing, and a cast-iron stove that heated quickly. She rode back to Mrs. Dunbar's each morning and worked there until noon, then returned to the ranch for the accounts. It made sense. She told herself firmly that it made sense and nothing else, and went to sleep, listening to the river and the wind in the cottonwoods. It was December when she found out. She had ridden into town for Mrs. Dunbar's post, as she sometimes did on a Thursday. The post office was a corner of the general store where Mr. Prentice sorted the mail 3 times a week with the methodical good nature of a man who knew his importance to a small community and didn't abuse it. He was sorting when she came in, and he handed her Mrs. Dunbar's bundle with one hand while still working through the pile with the other. "Silas Worth," he said, not to her but to himself, reading the name off an envelope. Haven't seen one of these in a while." He set it in the box for the South Road. Used to send regular as rain, that one. Sent a lot of letters. More than seemed right, for a man who wasn't much for town. He glanced up. His wife picks up the post, mostly. Bertie Worth. Nice woman, better than he deserves, probably. Evangeline stood very still. Mr. Prentice looked at her more carefully then. He had the eyes of a man who had run a general store for 30 years, which meant he saw everything and usually kept it to himself. But now she could see the moment he understood, the slight shift in his expression, the way he stopped moving. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't think." She put Mrs. Dunbar's letters into her coat pocket. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. "How long has he been married?" 7 years, Mr. Prentice said. "At least 7 years." She walked out of the store and stood on the board sidewalk in the thin December sun, and she breathed. He had been married 7 years, while he was writing to her about the morning light, while he was signing his name at the bottom of letters, while she was sitting in her pantry room in Pittsburgh, reading the words of an honest man. I mean what I say, I mean every word, and allowing herself, slowly, carefully, to hope. She stood there long enough for the wind to find the gap between her collar and her scarf. Then she straightened and went to her horse. Owen was at the south fence when she got back, stringing new wire. He saw her face when she dismounted, and he set down his fence pliers, without being asked. She told him. Her voice was even. She was beginning to think that evenness was a skill you built the way you built a callus. From repeated pressure, over time, until the nerve endings stopped flinching. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. His jaw tightened once, near the end, a brief muscular movement that he controlled quickly. When she finished, there was silence except for the wind off the river. "There are laws," he said. "Mail fraud. I know the county sheriff." She had already thought about this on the 3-mile ride back from town. She had thought about letters, investigations, her own name carried around the county as the subject of a cautionary story. She had thought about the word pity and all the ways it could be extended to a woman who had crossed half a country for a man who had a wife already. And what would come of it, she asked. My name in the sheriff's report. People looking at me sideways at church. Bertie Worth being humiliated for what her husband did. She shook her head. The debt is his. I'd rather not spend what's left of the winter collecting it. Owen looked at her for a long moment. You're not a foolish woman, he said at last. It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like a fact being acknowledged, but the way he said it made something settle in her chest. I'm not, she agreed. I was careless with my hope. Once. I don't intend to make that mistake again. He nodded once. He picked his fence pliers back up, and she went inside to work on the ledgers, and the afternoon went on, the way afternoons do, and neither of them said anything more about it. But that evening at supper, they had taken to eating together in the kitchen, a gradual thing, the table acquiring 2 chairs over the weeks, the way a stream acquires a second bank. Owen set down his fork and looked at her across the table in a way he hadn't before. Your hope, he said, for a different life. Did you leave it there? In that sheriff's report you didn't write? She considered the question. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. No, she said slowly. I don't think I did. He looked at his plate. He was quiet for a long time, the way he was quiet before he said anything that mattered. Good, he said, and went back to eating. She lay awake that night listening to the cottonwoods and thinking about that one word and all the weight it was carrying. Winter settled in hard after that. Snow in the second week of January, deep enough to make the road to town difficult. And then for a stretch of 5 days impassable. She was not marooned. She had her work. The accounts were coming into order in a way that genuinely pleased her, and the house was warm and quiet and had developed a domestic rhythm that felt oddly natural. She cooked. He chopped wood and kept the fire. They ate together. In the evenings she read or sewed, and he worked with his hands at the kitchen table, mending leather, sharpening things, occasionally carving a small piece of wood that he would set aside without comment. One evening he put something down beside her coffee cup, without a word, and went back to his chair. It was a small meadowlark, carved from pale wood, the size of her palm. The detail in the wings was extraordinary. Not pretty, but exact, the way a man carves something he has actually seen rather than imagined. She looked at it for a long time. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, the way men do when they've given something of themselves and aren't certain they should have. Hands get restless. She set the meadowlark on the windowsill above the desiccant, where it stayed. The snow melt came in March, and with it the return of the ordinary world. The road and open again, town reachable. The social fabric of Harlan's Creek reasserting itself in the form of invitations to church and Mrs. Dunbar's inquiring looks, and the general pleasant nosiness of a small community that had been watching a particular situation develop all winter with considerable interest. The ledgers were finished in early April, she told him on a Sunday evening, setting the final balanced book on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup. He picked it up, turned through it. She had seen his father's records, chaotic, good-hearted, and ultimately incomplete, and she had made them into something clean and navigable, 3 years of a ranch's life given back to itself in clear columns. "This is fine work," he said. "The work is done." The words sat there between them, meaning more than they said. He set the ledger down carefully. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first evening on the train platform, that attentive, deciding look. Except now he was not a stranger, and he was not deciding about a situation. He was deciding about something else entirely, and they both knew it. "I've been slow," he said. "You have," she agreed. Corner of his mouth moved, barely, but she saw it. "The fence posts are all set. Calves are all marked. The books are done." He looked down at his hands, the big calloused hands that were so sure of everything they touched. "I've been trying to find a reason to ask you to stay. And? Ran out of reasons." He looked up. "Ran out of things that needed fixing. Except," he stopped. He took a breath. "The house is quiet, Evangeline. It's been quiet for a long time. Since you came, it hasn't been. And I don't." He stopped again. He was not a man who lost his words easily, and watching him lose them now was the most affecting thing she had seen in a long time. "I don't want it to go back to the way it was." Outside, the river was running high with snowmelt, the sound of it coming through the kitchen window. She'd cracked for the spring air. "I am not the man from the letters," he said. "I don't write things pretty. I can't tell you things will be easy. But I see you, Evangeline. I see who you are, and I would like," he steadied himself, "I would like it if you stayed, not for the books, as my wife." She had not cried on the train platform. She had not cried when Mr. Prentice told her about Bertie Worth, but she felt her eyes sting now, and she did not entirely prevent it. She thought about what she had wanted 8 months ago. A different life, a piece of land with morning light, the simple, specific weight of being somewhere you belonged. "Yes," she said. "Owen, yes." He let out a breath as if he'd been holding it since October. They were married on a Saturday in May, in the church with the working bell, with Mrs. Dunbar standing at Evangeline's left and old Mr. Aldrich at Owen's right. The town came, because small towns always come to weddings. And because they had been watching this one coming together since December, with the quiet approval of people who know good work when they see it. Evangeline wore the blue dress she'd mended and let out at the hem to suit herself, with a sprig of wild hyacinth that Owen had left on her windowsill that morning without a word. His hands were steady when he held hers. They were always steady. 4 years later, the kitchen window faced south, and the morning light came in flat and golden across the table where Evangeline was making bread. Their daughter, 3 years old and serious as her father, sat on the kitchen floor, carefully arranging a row of river pebbles in size order. Their son, 18 months, and possessed of the cheerful, purposeful stubbornness of a calf that has found a gap in a fence, was asleep in the room off the kitchen, which was no longer a canning room, but something much better. She could hear Owen in the yard, the rhythmic knock of an axe against a block, steady as a clock. The bread dough pushed back against her hands, warm and alive, and she worked it with the particular satisfaction of someone doing a thing they have done enough times to do without thinking. The hyacinth she'd planted beside the front step had spread along the foundation and was coming up for the 4th spring, improbably blue against the gray stone. She looked out the window at the line of cottonwoods along the river, bare-branched through the winter, and now beginning to green at the tips, and she thought about that train platform. The copper shadows, the empty bench, the sickening quiet. She thought about the man who hadn't come, and all the words he had written, every one of them a small careful lie. And she thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the thing that breaks apart in your hands is not the thing that was supposed to last. Sometimes the breaking is a door, and on the other side of it is a morning like this, bread dough and river light, and a little girl arranging stones, and the sound of an axe, steady and reliable, outside. Owen came in for water and stopped in the doorway, the way he sometimes did, just for a moment, watching. She was aware of him the way you become aware of the permanent things, the river, the house, the mountains on the horizon. Solid, there. Their daughter looked up at him and raised a pebble. Papa. Biggest. That's a good one, he said seriously, coming over to crouch beside her and examine the pebble with the full gravity it deserved. Evangeline watched them. The bread dough rested under her hands. The letters were gone, burned, last winter, in the kitchen stove on a January evening when the snow was deep and the fire was warm, and she had simply decided she was done carrying them. They had taken about 30 seconds to burn. She had watched them go without feeling much of anything. Which was, she thought, exactly right. She had kept one thing, though. The meadowlark on the windowsill, pale wood worn smooth at the tail, where she sometimes touched it without thinking. Still there, above the desk where the accounts were kept in perfect order, still watching the south window with its head slightly tilted as if listening for something. She supposed she knew, now, what it had been listening for. Owen stood and caught her watching him, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way. She had come to know as well as her own heartbeat. "Bread's ready," he said. 10 minutes, she said. He nodded and went back outside, and she turned to the dough, and the river ran on beyond the cottonwoods, and the house was warm, and it was full. It was so entirely, improbably full, of everything that had been built here one quiet day at a time, out of nothing but steadiness and small true things.